At the heart of American power stands a white stone palace the world knows by one name, the White House. A symbol of democracy, of leadership, of freedom. But buried beneath its polished floors and glowing columns is a truth rarely spoken aloud. A truth mixed with sweat, blood, and silence. Between 1792 and 1800, as the young United States rushed to build its seat of power in Washington, something darker took shape alongside it. Hundreds of enslaved black men were forced to raise the walls of liberty, while being denied liberty themselves. They built the home of presidents. Then they vanished from the record. This is the story of the enslaved men who built America's power and were erased by it. Washington did not rise cleanly from vision or idealism. It was dragged out of mud and water by force. In 1792, the land chosen for the new capital was a hostile stretch of swamp along the Potomac, thick with insects and disease. The air carried rot, and the ground swallowed boots whole. White planners imagined marble avenues and national glory, but they had no workforce willing to suffer this place. So they turned, as America often did, to enslaved black men. From nearby plantations in Maryland and Virginia, human beings were rented like tools. Their bodies became the first real foundation of the nation's future power. These men were not volunteers, nor were they builders by choice. Many had never seen the Potomac before being marched toward it in chains or under armed watch. Some were farmers, others field hands, suddenly forced into brutal construction labor. Their names rarely appeared in full, often reduced to first names or tallies in government expense books. The federal commissioners who managed the project recorded payments not to the workers, but to the enslavers who owned them. Every swing of an axe enriched someone else. Every breath of swamp air reminded them they were expendable. The work began with clearing the land, and this alone broke bodies. Trees older than the nation were felled by hand, roots torn from wet earth with raw strength and crude tools. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly, spreading fevers that went untreated. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion killed silently, without ceremony. If a man collapsed, the schedule did not pause. Another enslaved worker would be pushed forward to take his place. The capital had deadlines, and mercy was not among the materials ordered. As the land was drained and leveled, enslaved laborers dug trenches and hauled soil under the watch of white overseers. These overseers answered to the federal government, making the suffering official, authorized, and paid for. Whips were not always necessary. Fear did most of the work. Runaway notices from this period reveal how desperate some men were to escape the swamp and the scaffolds. But the surrounding region was hostile, and capture meant beatings, branding, or worse. Freedom was close enough to imagine, yet far enough to punish hope itself. What makes this moment unbearable is its symbolism. While politicians spoke of liberty and a new democratic experiment, their government depended on unfree hands to survive. The very act of building a capital for freedom required the denial of freedom. Enslaved men worked beneath flags that promised rights they would never receive. Their sweat mixed into the clay meant to support a moral nation. This contradiction was not hidden, it was simply accepted. Power, from the very beginning, chose convenience over conscience. Many of these men were young, some not yet fully grown, their bodies forced to mature through punishment. They learned quickly or suffered for it. Mistakes were met with violence, not instruction. There were no safety measures, no medical care, no recognition of skill. And yet they adapted, lifting loads that crushed spines and spirits alike. Each day reshaped them into silent instruments of a future that excluded them entirely. By the end of 1792, The swamp had begun to change shape, but the men who changed it were already fading from memory. They left no written testimony, no recorded voices, no official acknowledgement of their sacrifice. All that remained were altered landscapes and government receipts. The capital was rising, slowly and painfully, on labor history would later try to forget. But the ground itself remembers who bled first for American power. The stone that would define the White House did not come from distant monuments or noble quarries of legend. It was pulled from the banks of Aquia Creek in Virginia, where enslaved black men were forced into some of the most dangerous labor of the entire project. These men were sent into pits and cliff faces with iron tools, splitting massive sandstone blocks by hand. Each strike echoed through the quarry like a warning. There were no machines to soften the work, only muscle, sweat, and obedience. The stone was heavy, unforgiving, and demanded flesh in return. Quarry work required skill, yet skill brought no respect. Enslaved laborers learned to read stone grain, measure fractures, and shape blocks that would fit perfectly into the president's house. One mistake could shatter weeks of labor or crush a limb. Fingers were lost. Backs were broken. If a man became injured, he was often discarded and replaced. The government's ledgers continued smoothly, listing payments for Negro hire, while broken bodies were carried away without record. The stone survived. The men did not. Once cut, the blocks had to be moved, and this was where suffering multiplied. Enslaved workers loaded stones weighing hundreds of pounds onto wagons and barges. The journey from Aquia Creek to Washington was slow and brutal. Barges moved along the Potomac, exposed to weather and current, while wagons lurched over uneven ground. Men slipped, were crushed, or drowned. No memorial marked the river for those lost beneath its surface. The water closed over them, and construction moved on. At the building site, enslaved men became masons, lifting and stacking stone with precision. Scaffolding rose, unstable and unforgiving, and falls were common. A single misstep could mean death, but safety nets did not exist. White master masons supervised, while black laborers bore the risk. The irony was merciless. Men denied ownership of their own bodies were trusted to shape the walls of presidential power. Each stone they placed locked them further into invisibility. These laborers worked under constant pressure to meet deadlines imposed by politicians eager to occupy their new palace. Speed mattered more than survival. If a man slowed from exhaustion, punishment followed. Hunger hollowed their strength, yet expectations never lessened. Nights offered little rest, as many slept in crude shelters or open air, bodies aching and infected wounds festering. Dawn brought the same command: lift, carry, build, obey. What history rarely admits is that the White House required craftsmanship, not just brute force. Enslaved men became experts through pain. Their hands shaped edges that still align centuries later. Their understanding of stone allowed the building to endure fire, war, and time. Yet when credit was given, it flowed upward to architects and politicians. The men who turned rock into legacy were erased from the narrative, their mastery buried beneath plaster and paint. When the final stones were set, the enslaved quarry workers did not stand back to admire their work. They were sent away, sold, returned, or forced into other labor. The White House stood complete, gleaming with authority, while its true builders vanished into anonymity. But stone remembers pressure. It remembers the hands that shaped it. And every wall still carries the weight of men who were never meant to be remembered, but never truly disappeared. Life for the enslaved men working on the White House existed in a narrow space between exhaustion and terror. Their days began before sunrise, when the air was still heavy with dampness and the threat of disease. They were driven from crude shelters toward scaffolds, trenches, and stone piles, bodies already sore before the labor even started. Food was scarce and poorly prepared, barely enough to sustain the strength demanded of them. Hunger followed them like a shadow, weakening muscles that were expected to perform without failure. The camps where they slept were temporary, overcrowded, and filthy. There were no proper beds, only dirt floors, straw, or rotting wood. Mosquitoes bred in standing water nearby, carrying fevers that spread quickly among men whose immune systems were already worn down. Illness did not excuse absence. A sick man was still expected to work, and if he collapsed, punishment often followed instead of care. The federal project could not afford delays, and enslaved lives were cheaper than schedules. Overseers maintained control through constant surveillance and violence. Whips, chains, and public beatings were not rare events but tools of management. Punishment was meant to be seen, reinforcing fear among the rest. The men learned to keep their eyes down, movements efficient, emotions hidden. Any sign of resistance, even exhaustion, could be interpreted as defiance. Authority came not only from the overseers but from the certainty that the law would never protect them. Despite this, escape lingered in their thoughts. The proximity of cities, rivers, and free black communities made freedom seem possible, if only for a moment. Some men ran at night, slipping into darkness with nothing but hope. Their absence triggered immediate response. Advertisements printed with descriptions of bodies, scars, and clothing, promising rewards for capture. Dogs were used. Patrols spread outward. When fugitives were caught, their punishment was severe and public, designed to crush the idea of escape itself. Psychological violence cut as deeply as physical abuse. Families were separated without warning, sometimes during the project itself. A man might arrive at camp knowing his wife or child had been sold away miles in the opposite direction. Grief was not permitted. There was no space to mourn, only stone to lift and earth to move. Silence became survival. Each man carried his suffering inward, because sharing it could be used against him. What made the cruelty unbearable was its official nature. These men were not being abused by criminals or rogue overseers. They were being worked and punished under federal authority. The same government that spoke of justice and representation allowed this system to function without shame. Commissioners approved expenses for chains and guards alongside tools and materials. Violence was built into the process, written quietly into budgets and schedules. By the time night fell, bodies were trembling with fatigue. Wounds throbbed untreated. Some men whispered prayers, others stared into darkness, wondering how long they could endure. Morning always came too soon, dragging them back into the same cycle. The White House rose steadily, stone by stone, while its builders lived suspended between the scaffold and the lash. Their suffering became invisible even as the building grew impossible to ignore. When the White House reached completion around 1800, there was no ceremony for the men who had built it. No gathering, no acknowledgement, no word spoken in their name. President John Adams moved into the unfinished building quietly, focused on politics and legacy. The enslaved laborers who made that moment possible were already being removed from the site. Some were marched back to the plantations they had been rented from. Others were sold to new enslavers, their skills absorbed and forgotten. Their connection to the White House was severed instantly, deliberately. It was as if they had never existed at all. The government's relationship with these men ended the moment their usefulness did. Ledger books closed, payments stopped, and the project was declared complete. There was no effort to preserve names, stories, or even numbers accurately. History preferred clean victories, not inconvenient truths. The White House stood as a finished symbol, while its builders disappeared into bondage again. Some returned to fields after years of skilled labor, reduced once more to anonymity. Others were separated from families they had barely held onto during construction. The nation moved forward, leaving them behind without a backward glance. What followed was not just neglect, but intentional erasure. Early histories of Washington praised architects, commissioners, and presidents. They described stone, symmetry, and vision, but never the hands that lifted it all. Textbooks spoke of democracy rising in marble silence. The enslaved workers were excluded because acknowledging them shattered the myth. To admit their role meant admitting that freedom's house was built by the unfree. So silence became policy, repeated generation after generation. Absence hardened into official memory. For the men themselves, life after construction offered no reward. There were no wages, no land, no promise of emancipation. Their bodies bore permanent damage from years of dangerous labor. Scars, twisted joints, and chronic illness followed them for life. Yet these injuries brought no sympathy, only further exploitation. Enslavers profited from skills learned under federal command. The government took the benefit, then denied responsibility. Power washed its hands clean. Some of these men likely lived long enough to hear stories of the White House. They may have listened as others spoke of presidents and national pride. Few would have dared say, "I built that place." Such a claim could invite punishment or disbelief. Their truth had no protection in law or culture. Even free black communities struggled to preserve these stories. Memory survived only in fragments, passed quietly, if at all. Most vanished without a trace. The cruelty lies not only in enslavement, but in the timing of the forgetting. Erasure began immediately, not centuries later. The moment the White House could stand alone, its builders were discarded. America's power required their invisibility to feel legitimate. Acknowledgement would have stained the narrative beyond repair. So forgetting became part of the architecture itself. Stone rose upward, while truth was buried underneath. Silence was the final brick laid. Today, the White House remains a global symbol of authority and leadership. But its completion marked the quiet end of hundreds of stolen lives' recognition. The men who built it did not vanish by accident. They were erased because remembering them changes everything. It forces a reckoning with how power was born, and how easily suffering is absorbed into triumph. The building endured, their names did not. Yet history is still catching up to what was taken. Today, the White House is presented as timeless, solid, untouched by the ugliness of its origins. Visitors admire its columns, its symmetry, its calm authority. Cameras glide across polished rooms where decisions shape the world. Yet beneath every step lies stone that remembers pressure, weight, and fear. Buildings do not forget how they are made. The walls still hold the imprint of hands that were never meant to leave a mark. Silence has not erased them, it has only buried them deeper. For generations, the absence of these men from history felt intentional, almost ritualistic. Their stories were not lost accidentally. They were excluded because they complicated the story America wanted to tell itself. To honor them would mean admitting that power was built on captivity, that democracy rested on forced labor, that freedom spoke loudly while practicing silence. So remembrance was delayed, postponed, avoided, until forgetting felt natural. The White House stood clean, while its past remained unspoken. In recent years, historians have begun to recover fragments of truth from payroll records and forgotten correspondence. Names appear briefly, then vanish again into gaps of record. These discoveries do not feel like closure, they feel like wounds reopening. Each recovered name represents dozens more lost forever. There are no portraits, no graves marked with honor, no first-hand testimonies preserved. What remains is absence shaped like a person. And absence can be louder than memory. The horror of this history lies not only in suffering, but in endurance. The White House survived fire, war, and time. The men who built it survived none of the recognition. Their labor strengthened a nation that denied their humanity. Yet their influence is permanent. Every meeting held within those walls depends on their work. Every speech delivered their echoes through rooms shaped by their hands. Power still rests on what they were forced to give. There is also a quiet form of revenge embedded in truth itself. No matter how long history tries to hide these men, the facts refuse to stay buried. Stone cracks, archives open, stories resurface. The myth weakens with every revelation. The White House can no longer stand as a symbol of purity without carrying its shadow. The very structure meant to project authority now exposes contradiction. Memory becomes resistance, and remembrance becomes a form of justice delayed but not denied. To remember these men is not to diminish the building, but to strip away illusion. It forces the nation to confront how deeply exploitation shaped its foundations. It challenges comfort and demands accountability from the past into the present. These men were denied voices in life, but history grants them one now. Their story changes how power is understood. It reminds us that greatness built on suffering carries a cost that never fully disappears. The White House still stands, bright against the sky, guarded and revered. But it is no longer silent. Its stones speak through recovered names, uncomfortable truths, and unresolved pain. The enslaved black men who built America's power did not vanish completely. They live in every question asked of history, every demand for honesty, every refusal to forget. And as long as the building stands, their story will remain, pressing upward, waiting to be fully heard.